These are the annotations and the code of the application that I have given in the document regarding how we can able to use annotations like @value annotation, how to write properties files, and at the same time, how to use @property source annotation. So these are the annotations that we discussed in the previous. And today we are going to see some of the important annotations that we have. So now today we are going to look at about annotations called @scope annotation. And in the last session, I also told about how to use @lazy annotation, right? And I have shown like how @lazy is working. So like @lazy annotation, now we have annotations called @scope. And we have the other annotation called @post construct and pre-destroy. So these are the annotations you have to learn as part of the Spring core sessions. Okay, so first let us understand them. Observe here. So what actually we are going to see today, there is an annotation called @scope. So now we are going to look at about the annotation called @scope. We have the annotation called @scope, right? We have annotation called @scope. And also we have the annotation called @post construct. And also we have the other annotation which is called @pre-destroy. So these are the different annotations we have. And now we are going to just discuss about such annotations now. So first we are going to understand about annotation called @scope today. Actually, this is class level annotation or method level annotation, which means what I can able to use this annotation at class, or I can also able to use this annotation at the method. So that is basically called a class level annotation or method level. And that's what the meaning of that. Okay. So what is the use of this annotation? Basically, this annotation is used to define the scope of a Spring Bean class. The default scope of a Spring Bean class is singleton. This is the default scope. So if the scope of a Spring Bean is singleton, which means the Spring container is going to create. Spring container creates a single object of the bean class. And the same object will be used by the container every time. Means within the Spring container, there exists only single object for that bean class because the scope is singleton. Right? So the Spring container, in the Spring container, there is a single object is created for the bean class because the scope is singleton. Normally, for every bean, suppose if you don't specify the scope annotation @scope, right? So if you don't specify this annotation, what is the default scope? Singleton only. Which means, for example, I am writing something like this. @component. Only I'm writing @component or @service or @repository, any stereotype annotation that we know. Any stereotype annotation that we know. I'm writing @component. And let's say, for example, I'm writing a component. Public class, let's say scheduler. Some methods are there inside it. Now, if you look at this, this is the component, but I'm not giving or I'm not providing any annotation called @scope at the class level. Means what is the default scope of this scheduler component? Singleton. Singleton. Right? I no need to particularly specify the annotation called @scope of singleton. So even though I'm not writing this annotation, what's the default scope only? The default scope of this component is singleton. Am I clear with that? The scope is what now? Singleton. So if the scope is a singleton, what do you understood? If the scope of a bean is singleton, what did you understood? There is only one object created for the class. Okay, only one object is created for the class by the Spring container, and the same object will be used by the container for every time. For example, there are two more classes are available. This is the dependency class. There are two dependent classes are there. This is dependent class 1. This is dependent class 2. Okay, dependent class 1 and dependent class 2. There are two dependent classes are there. Able to follow me? Now tell me, the Spring container is now going to inject two different objects of the scheduler component to the dependent class 1 and dependent class 2, or is a Spring container is going to inject the same object to the dependent class 1 and dependent class 2? This is the dependent class 1, depends on scheduler. This is the dependent class 2. This is also depends on scheduler, which means there are how many dependent classes are available? Two dependent classes are available. The two dependent classes, and there is a single dependency class. What is the scope of this dependency class? Singleton scope. If the scope of an object is singleton, then what Spring container do? Will it create two different objects for injecting for dependent class 1 and dependent class 2? Or will inject the same object to both the dependent classes? Same object, because scope singleton means how many objects are created? Only single object is created, and that single object of the scheduler will be injected to what and what? Dependent class 1, and also will be injected to what? Dependent class 2, because scope is singleton. Okay. So what's the default scope of a Spring component? Spring component means every Spring Bean class is called one component. What is the default scope of a Spring Bean component? Singleton. Okay, singleton means the Spring container can create how many objects? Only one object. Within the container, how many objects are created? One object is created for the Bean class, and that one object will be used always by the container for injecting to the other beans or other dependent beans. That's called scope singleton. That's a default scope. Now, if you talk about this annotation called @scope, this annotation is containing, this scope annotation is containing the values like this. Default value singleton, and the second value of the scope is prototype. Third value is called request. Fourth value is called session. And the fifth value is called application. Okay, right? So in old versions, I mean before Spring 2.5 version, this application scope named as global session. So, but from Spring, not in 6 version, even in Spring 2.5 after, this name is removed. The scope global session value is removed and given as what? Application. So basically you can understand that there are 5 scopes we can define. Okay, there are 5 scopes available that we can define for a Bean class or a Spring Bean component. By default scope is singleton. Okay, scope singleton means what? Within the Spring container, only one object will be created for that Bean class within the Spring container, and the same object will be used always by the container. Am I right or not? That's what the meaning of scope. Okay, the scope tells about the scope of a Spring Bean component or the visibility of a Spring Bean component simply.
Can you repeat
Correct?
the last singleton, please?
Yeah. So scope singleton. Okay. Scope by default is singleton, which means the Spring container is going to create a single object because scope is singleton. The container is now going to create a single object for the bean class, and the same object will be used by the container for injecting to dependent classes. Dependent classes, or we can say dependent objects, whatever. So within the Spring container, how many objects are created for that bean class? Only one object will be created because the scope is singleton. Suppose if I change the scope to prototype, if I change the scope as prototype, then the Spring container will create a new object every time when the bean is required. Which means what? If the scope is changed to prototype, within the Spring container, multiple objects can be created for the bean class. Scope singleton means only one object is created within the container. Means the container is going to create a single object because the scope is singleton, and the container will use the same object for injecting to the dependent objects. Means container will provide the single object of the bean class to everyone. If a scope is prototype, the container will create multiple objects. Every time a new object is created by the container if required. Same example. If, for example, assume that I am writing something like this. We are discussing about the scope called what? Prototype. For example, I am writing annotations like this. At scope, or let's say at component, okay, at component, and also I'm writing at scope. Value equals to prototype. I'm writing what? At scope, value is equal to prototype. Of course, it's not compulsory, or it is not mandatory to provide the parameter name, because the parameter name is what here? Value. Within annotation, if you are passing any parameters, a single parameter, and if the parameter name is what? Value parameter, then no need of providing the parameter name, right? We can avoid the parameter name. So scope, prototype. Value equal to what here? Prototype. I'm writing scope is equal to prototype. Next, I'm writing public class. Class name can be any name, sir. I'm just taking something. Okay, public class, let's say. Some class name, I'm thinking about class, okay. Let's say, for example, order food. Now I have a component called order food. Okay, right? This component scope is what? Prototype. Okay, prototype. Now, there are two dependent classes. Let's say this is dependent class 1. This is the dependent class 2. There are two dependent classes are there, which means what? Dependent class 1 depends on order food. Dependent class 2 depends on order food. Order food is a dependency class. It's a Spring Bean component, but it is a dependency class. These are the dependent classes. This is the dependency class. But what's the scope of this? Prototype. So while injecting the dependency object, what the Spring container will do, because of the scope is prototype, it will create a new object. It will create a new object every time when the object is required. Are able to get my point now? Every time whenever object is required, what container will do? Creates a new object. So for injecting to the dependent class one, order food object is required. So container will create a new object of order food and it will be injected to the dependent class one. And for injecting to the dependent class two, also order food object is required. So whenever an object is required, what container will do immediately? Creates a new object. It will create a new object, will initialize that object, then will inject this object. Now you tell me for this order food, there are how many objects are created? Multiple, 2 objects are created. Means multiple, more than one object is created because here prototype. If the scope is a singleton, what container do? Suppose if the bean scope is a singleton, these are called Spring Bean scopes. Okay. If the scope is a singleton, then what the container will do? The Spring container will create only one object of the Spring Bean class and same object will be provided to the others whenever it is required. So within the Spring container, how many objects are created for that Bean class? One object is created. If a scope is prototype, the container will create a new object every time if it is required. Right? Means within the Spring container, there is only one object created for this order food class, or within the container, multiple objects can be created. Multiple objects can be created because the scope is what? Prototype. We are going to see that. Okay, right. Similarly, there is request scope. Value is equal to request. Okay. If a scope is equal to request, or if a scope is equal to session or application, these request, session, and application, these, okay, I repeat once again, these scopes are valid when we are developing the web applications. Suppose today we are discussing about Spring Core application. So here we don't have any request or we don't have any session. So where request, session, and application scopes can be used in the web applications development, because in web applications only we can find what? Request objects, session objects, application objects. Okay. Suppose that the scope is equal to request. What will happen if a scope is a request? For each request, what the Spring container will create now? A new object for each request. It will create a new object for the Spring Bean component for each request. Right? And once that request is completed, this object will be removed from the container. Because what is the scope of this object? Request scope. Okay, by writing scope value is equal to request, you are telling that what this scope, the scope of this object is request scope. The scope of this object is what? Request scope. See, for example, I'm writing a component like this, @scope, value is equal to request, @component. And let's say, for example, I'm writing public class, right? Let's say okay, let's say we will create different examples later, but currently I'm writing a simple class name only. Okay. For each request, one new object will be created. That's what the point of it. Public class, some components are, let's say component A. For example, there is a component called A, simple A is a component. Now you tell me, when I write scope is equal to request, when I write scope request, then tell me for every new request, Means for each request, what the Spring container will create? The Spring container will create a new object of class A. And what is the scope of this object within that request? Within the request. Within that request. Means this object is visible within the container only for this request. What happens once the request is completed? This object will be automatically destroyed by the container. If there are two requests are came, suppose my application is server-side application, web application. Client 1 is sending one request, client 2 is sending another request. Then what happens now? For each new request, what will be created? New object will be created. One new object is created for this request and another new object is created for this second request. And what is the scope of this object in the container? Until the request is completed. What is the scope of this object? Until the request is completed. Once the request is completed, automatically the container will destroy them. Because you are providing the scope is equal to what? Request. So if a scope request, what does it mean now? Within the Spring container, that object is visible until that request is completed. So container will create a new object for each request, and that object will be available in the container until the request is completed. Once request is completed, automatically that object will be removed by the container, destroyed by the container. Right? Will be destroyed by the container. Because the scope is equal to what are you saying? Request. So in web development, you guys know about difference between a request and a session. Request and session. Request means one request. Session means I can say user session. User session means suppose I am a user. I can able to send multiple requests to server. So which means these multiple requests are sent by one user. One user means one session. One user means one session. One user can send multiple requests. I have sent, for example, I'm a user, I have sent request 1. Then after that, I sent request 2. Then I sent a request 3. Then I sent request 4, request 5. These 5 requests are made by one user only. This is called user session. Okay, that's called user session. So session is nothing but it is the multiple requests sent by same user. Multiple requests sent by same user is called what? Session. See, for example, user has first logged in and user is going to finally log out. In between login to log out, this user is going to surf the website. The user is going to click some links, buttons, and then trying to move from one page to other page, try to fetch some data or try to do some purchases, something like that. So between this time of login to log out, the user is going to make multiple requests or not? Right? So this total from login to log out is called what one? Session. From this login to log out, it is called what one? Session. One session. Within a session, user can make multiple requests. Within one session, what user can make? Multiple requests. If a scope is a session, what does it mean? The container is going to create one object for the Spring Bean for the user session. So when that object will be destroyed by the Spring container, once the user log out. Log out means what? Session is completed. Once the user session is completed, then container will destroy the object. Is it creating object for every request or for a session of a user? For a session of a user. When the scope is session scope. When the scope is what? Session. When the scope is session. The difference between request and session, what? What's the difference between request and session? Request means The container is going to create a new object for each request for a Spring Bean class. That is called what scope? Request scope. Okay, that's called request scope. But session means what? The container is creating a new object for what? The container is creating a new object for each session, user session, not for every request. Means what? The container will maintain that object for session of the user. When the user session is expired, then container will destroy the object. That's called scope session. So in which programming, in which type of applications development, we are going to use the bean scope as request or bean scope as session? In web application development. Suppose we are creating a console application now. Suppose I am creating one console small. It's not a web application. Just we are creating one small application with main method and we are trying to execute that program, right? So you tell me in our current application, in our console application, do we have any requests? Do we have any sessions? No. So where can we find the requests from the clients, sessions, application, web applications? In web applications only we can find out. So which means request, session, and application. These three bean scopes can be used in what type of application development? Web applications development. In web applications development, Spring MVC applications or Spring REST applications, we can able to make the scope of a bean as what? Either request or session or application. So what is the difference between request and session scopes? What is the difference between request scope and session scope? Request scope means what? The Spring container will create a new object for each request for a bean class. And a container will automatically destroy the object once the request is completed. If a scope session, the container creates one object for a Spring Bean class and will be used for the user session, will be used within the user session. And when the session of the user is expired, automatically container will destroy the object. That is called session scope. Now, application scope means what? It is greater than session. Application scope means it is now going to create a one object for the Spring Bean class, and that object will be shared for all the users for the entire application until application destroyed. Until what is destroyed? Application destroyed. Means the object is available in the container until application is live. If application goes down, then the object will be destroyed. Because the scope is what? Application scope. As long as application is alive, the Spring Bean component is also alive in the container. Is also alive in the container. And whenever application goes down, automatically the object is also destroyed. Because the scope is what now? Application. Application means the one object is created by the Spring container for the entire application for that bean class, not for one user. That object can be shared with all users and with all requests as well. This is called application scope. So request, session, application. These are three scopes that we are going to use in which type of application development? Web application. For example, today we are discussing about only singleton. I can show you, and I can also show you about one more thing that is called what? Prototype. What is scope singleton? What does it mean like scope singleton?
One object is created in Spring Boot.
Yes, singleton. If a scope is a singleton, what does it mean? Yeah, if the scope is a singleton, what does it mean? The container creates only one object. That scope tells the container about how many objects you should create. That's what the meaning of scope. What scope is telling the container? How many objects you have to create. Okay. Singleton means what is telling the container? You have to create a single object and use the same object always. That's called what scope? Singleton. Prototype means what it is telling the container? Telling the container whenever object is required for this component, you create a new one and use it. Create a new one and use it. That is called scope prototype. If a multiple times are required, then container has to create multiple objects. What request scope is telling the container? Is telling the container that create a single object for this class, for this bin component, for this request. Okay, create a new object for each request. What session is telling the container? Create one object of this component and use it for enter the session until the session is expired. What application is telling the container? Create one object of this class and use it for the entire life of the application. Whenever application goes down, then you destroy it. So scope tells the container how many objects you should create and when you should create the object. Are able to get my point now? What scope is going to tell the container? How many objects the container has to create and when to create. That information is provided to the container by using which annotation? Scope annotation. Scope annotation. Right? Very good. Now, what and what scopes that we can able to see here? Singleton, prototype, because we are not developing web application. And when we are in web application development, then we'll be having what and what scopes? Request scope, session scope, and application scope. Request scope, session scope, and application scope. Application scope. Are you able to get my point? Yes. So try to understand what I'm trying to tell you now. Okay, right, good. See, we are going to look at about that. Request means only for one request. Request means only for one request. One request. Okay, right. See, for example, I'm just creating one component in my application. And this component means this object has to store. Okay, this object has to store the filter conditions. The filter condition that a user is requesting. Filter conditions means, for example, user has a form. In that form, he don't want to see the entire data, but he is searching for some products. Okay, there is a search box available. Search box available. And in the search box, the user is going to enter the searching criteria. What type of products he want to see. Am I right or not? What type of products he want to see. This is user one. It's a user one. Client one or user one. Whatever the searching criteria that user has provided, I want to store this information into one object. For example, there is user 2. This user 2 is also searching for some products and he is providing some search criteria. Some such criteria. And he is going to send a request by clicking on submit button. Then I want to store it in another object. Now you tell me this object is for storing the user one's this request filter conditions. This object is to store this second request filter conditions. Filter conditions. Are you able to follow me? That is going to become filter conditions. For example, in Amazon or somewhere, you are having filter options, brands you are selecting, I want to see only these brands of chappals. And the price range is from this to this. Am I right or not? And rating is 4 and above. Like that, you are applying somewhat filter conditions you are applying. And finally, you are going to click on show results. By selecting all your filter conditions, what are you going to click here? Show results. In Amazon, you're doing like that. Now you tell me these are all the filter conditions requested by this user. In this request, whatever the filter conditions are given by the user, I would like to store all the filter conditions into one component, one object. Similarly, another user is there. He may apply different filter conditions. And he's also clicking on which button? Show. Now tell me these filter conditions of this request, I want to store in one more object. You tell me in this case now, I have to create a one single Spring Bean component, means one Spring Bean or multiple Spring Beans. Multiple objects or one object, multiple. For this request, to store the filter conditions of the request, one object. To store the filter conditions of the second request, in this case, I need what? One object for each request. Then tell me the component in which I want to store the filter conditions, that component I need to keep it as request scope or singleton scope. Request scope. What is the problem with the singleton scope? Only one object will be created by the container, right? Then what happens now, for example, first guy is requesting. Second guy also requesting simultaneously. What will happen now? First person's or the customer's filter conditions will be overridden second user filter conditions. Now the first user also getting response like second user conditions. Because how many objects are created? The scope is singleton. One object is created. See, I'm creating one component like this. For example, at component, let us say I'm creating one annotation called, I'm using annotation called what? At component. And I'm writing, for example, public class filter conditions. Filter conditions. There is a class. Now you tell me, if you don't specify @scope of request, what the default scope of this class? Singleton. Tell me if the scope is singleton, then within the Spring container, how many objects are created? Only one object is created within the container, and the same object will be used by the container always. Am I right? This component purpose is to store the filter conditions, right? Now tell me if there are two users are sending the request with a different filter conditions. Then tell me first user filter conditions are stored in which object? Filter conditions object. Second user filter conditions are also going to be stored in which object only? Same filter conditions only. Will container create one more filter conditions object for this request, or same object will be used? Same object. If the same object is used, then what happens now? The previous filter conditions are overridden with new filter conditions. Second user filter conditions. Now you tell me, first user also getting the response like a second user. Actually, first user want different filter conditions and second user want different filter conditions. But for first user also, the response will be same as like second user. The problem is there. Now you tell me in this case, to store the filter conditions, do we need to use a single object or separate object for each request? Separate object for each request. Now you tell me for that case, in that case, what's the scope I need to write? @scope, @scope value equals to request. Did you guys understood the example here? Value is equal to what now? Request. Now you tell me if I say value is equal to request, what the Spring container will do? Okay, this is telling the Spring container, you create a new object for each request in the web development, each request. Then you tell me if first user is making request, then what container will create? New object. If the second user is making a request, again container will create new object. In this object, container will store the filter conditions of the first user's request. In this, second user's request. And how much time this object will be maintained in the container? The container will manage this object until the request is completed. Once the request is completed, automatically the container will destroy this object. Destroy that object. Now here tell me, the scope is what now, singleton or request? Request. Scope is request. Okay. So when to use scope, request, or session, or application in the web application development, we are going to make use of those three. But when we are non-web application means in Spring Core applications, what are the two scopes that we are going to use? One is called singleton and second one is called prototype. Prototype. Okay. First, let us have a discussion on this. So how do I identify, or how do I know that, or how can I know that? How can I know that only one object is created or multiple objects are created by the container when I change the scope from singleton to prototype? The only way that we can get the clarity is by writing a constructor. By writing a constructor and by adding some SOP statement in the constructor. Because whenever object is created, constructor gets executed automatically. So multiple objects are created, then the constructor will execute for multiple times. If a single object is created, then the constructor will execute for only one time. So by adding some SOP statement inside the constructor, we can able to identify that whether one object is created or multiple objects are created. So we are going to look at into that. What are the scopes so that we are going to discuss now? One is called singleton and second one is called prototype. But there are three more other scopes are available, and those three scopes we are going to see at the time of web application alone. When we are working with the Spring MVC application, I'll show you that at the time of Spring REST API application also, we are going to discuss about scope request, scope session, and scope application. Very good. So just wait for a minute, guys. I'll continue. Wait for a minute. Okay. So let's start now working with. There are two scopes that we can able to discuss now. I'll show you. What are the two scopes that we can discuss? One is called the singleton and second one is the prototype. These are the two scopes that we can able to discuss now in the console applications. When we are in only use in web applications, what are the scopes that we can only use in web applications? Request scope, next session scope, next application scope. What scope is telling the container? Scope tells the container like how many objects the container has to create and when it should create the object. For example, singleton means what happens? It is telling the container that container has to create a single object for this class. A single object for this class within the container. And use the same object within the container. That is called singleton. Prototype means what? Prototype means what? The container has to create a multiple. Whenever it is required, container has to create a new object. Container has to create a new object for this bean class whenever it is required. Whenever the object is required, it has to create a new object for the bean class. That is called prototype scope. Okay, correct? Prototype. And of course, request means what? What request scope tells us container? The container has to create a new object for each HTTP request. Each HTTP request, the container has to create a new object. And that object gets destroyed automatically when the request is completed. Session means what? What is telling the container? The container has to create a new object for each user session. User session. It has to create one object for user session. Okay. User session means what? The session may continue for multiple requests also. A user session may continue for multiple requests also. Until the session get expired, the container has to use the same object. This is called what? Session scope. Application scope means what? The container has to create a one object and it should be shared for all users. So this object should be there in the container and container has to use the same object until this application get destroyed. That is called application scope. Okay, right. Understand the point here. So we will write, we will discuss like how we can able to use the scope as prototype and use the scope as singleton. These two things we can discuss. And one more point here. I have a question to you. For example, I have two beans are available. Let's say, for example, try to understand now. There is a component. You guys need to understand here. @ component. Okay, @ component. Please try to understand. @ component. @ scope. There is some discussion we are discussing here. I can write value is equal to. Otherwise, directly also I can write without using the parameter name. Okay. Component is one annotation. Scope is the other annotation. What is the scope I have provided here? Prototype. Let's say, for example, public class service A. Okay. You try to understand now. Public class service A. Now, here I am writing @autovoid. What I am writing @autovoid. Service B. You guys need to understand. And some other methods are available. I am applying the field injection. What I'm applying here? Field, because I'm writing this annotation at a field level. And you know, autovoid annotation could be used for what? Autovoid annotation could be used for injecting the dependency objects. It is like auto wiring. Okay, it is for injecting the dependency objects, dependency object. So now service A depends on service B. Service B. Very good. Please try to understand. Now, service B is also another component available here. So I am writing one annotation called @component. And also I'm writing other annotation called @scope of singleton. Of course, if I don't write, then also by default scope is what? Singleton only. By default scope is what? Singleton only. Then I'm writing public class service B. There are some methods available inside the service B. Assume that. Now you tell me what container is responsible for injecting the dependency objects. Who is responsible for injecting the dependency objects? Container. Tell me, container is now going to create one object of service A, or container can create a new object every time it is required. Every time it is required, because what's the scope? This prototype is telling the container that you create what? You create new object every time when the object is required. When the object is required, you create a new object every time it is required. Am I clear with that? Very good. Please try to understand now. Suppose the object is required 2 times. Example, assume that. Then tell me what container will create? 2 objects. But container responsible for injecting the dependency object also. Because of what? @auto-void. But this service B scope is what here? Singleton. Will the container inject 2 different objects of service B to the service A objects, or same service B object will be injected to the 2 service A objects? Same service B object will be injected to the service A objects. For service A, how many objects are required? 2 objects are required. Okay, but service A depends on what? Service B. Who is responsible for injecting the dependency object? Spring container. What is the scope of the service B? Singleton. You tell me how many objects the container has created for service B? 1 object. This 1 object is injected to what and what? To the service A and also to the service A. This is the object 1 of service A. This is object 2 of service A. This is object of service B. Of service B. Because what is the scope of this service B? Singleton. Singleton. Now I have a question to you. Okay, let us use the same scenario. Now reverse it. Its scope is singleton. But its scope is prototype. Now you tell me, this is a question I want to ask you. Tell me, what is the scope of service A? Singleton scope. The scope is singleton, then the container can create how many objects? 1 object of service A. Am I right or not? Now tell me, service B. What is the scope of service B? Prototype. Prototype means the container can create what? Container can create a new object and use it every time it is required. Am I right or not? Every time when the object is required, the container has to create a new object. That's what the scope prototype is telling the container. Very good. Now you tell me who should inject the dependency object? Container. What is the scope of service A? Singleton. What is the scope of service B? Prototype. Who is the dependent class? Service A. Who is the dependency class? Service B. My question is now, will the container be able to inject multiple objects of service B, the dependency object, to the service A or not? Because what's the scope of service B? Prototype. What a prototype tells? This scope will tell the container that you create a new object every time it is required and use it. Every time when it is required, you create a new object and use it. That's what the meaning of prototype. Now you tell me, container has to inject the service B object to service A because of which annotation? @auto-void. Now you tell me, will the container is going to inject a new object every time to the service A, or only one object is injected to the service A? The container is now going to inject one object of the service B to the service A, or multiple objects of service B to the service A. Actually, for service B, the container can create multiple objects. Are you able to follow me? Are you able to follow me, right? What I'm saying now, for the service B, container can create multiple objects because the scope is what? Prototype. Prototype. But how many objects of service B are injected to service A? One object only injected. Why one object only? Because for service A, how many objects are created? One object is created. One object only created. Na? Tell me, once object is created, immediately the container will follow the initialization task. You know the life cycle. First object is created. Next, immediately initialization. In the initialization, first dependencies are injected. Now you tell me, how many times the dependencies are injected for a class? One time. One time only. That's why you tell me, even though the scope is prototype, multiple objects of service B are injected to service A, or only one object is injected? One object is injected. Suppose if two classes are prototype, both of them are having prototype scope, then both of them are having prototype scope. Then scope prototype here, scope prototype here, both are scope prototype. Then every time when it is required, container can create what? New object of service A. Right? Whenever the new object is created, it has to inject the dependency object. Then it will create a new dependency object. If suppose two service A objects are created, then two service B objects are also created. Are you able to follow me? For example, SCA1, SCA2. What are these two? Two objects of service A. Then who is responsible for injecting the dependency object? Container. Service A depends on what? Service B. What is the scope of service B? Prototype scope. Prototype means what container has to do? Create a new object whenever it is required and use it. So for injecting the object, container creates a new service B object and will inject it to service A. Similarly, when second object service A, again it should inject the dependency object. Then again, whenever it is required, what container has to create? New object. SB2 is injected to SCA2. Here, in this case, both the beans are having same scope called what? Prototype scope. Did you guys understood how this singleton and prototype are working now? Right? Okay, good. See, what is the default scope of a Spring Bean? Singleton. Let me show you practically. Let us start. First, create one small application. To understand the singleton and prototype scopes, we are going to look at about one application. Okay, na? Okay. I'm going to start our workspace. You just observe it. We'll create a new project. Spring scope annotation. Okay. First, I'm going to create one new Maven project I'm going to create. And my Maven project is Spring scope annotation. First, we are going to choose Maven archetype pick start. What is it? Maven archetype pick start. So we are going to choose the Maven archetype pick start. Then you have to select next. Then here there is a artifact ID, means our project name. I'm writing Spring scope annotation. And I want to use my package name as com.pack.bean. Bean or beans. Okay, beans. And we will wait for until we get build success. So basically, I'm just going to here I'm going to use y for yes. Now I got build success, and also I got my project here called Spring scope annotation. Now here in the pom.xml, first we are going to add the dependency tag. So for that, first of all, we should go to dependency section, and here we should add one tag called what? Dependency. Dependency. Tell me, under the dependency tag, there are 3 more child tags that I need to add. What are the 3 more child tags? One is called group ID. What is the group ID? Arg.Spring Framework. Next one is what? Artifact ID. What is the artifact ID? Spring-context. Next one is what? Version. Version 6.2.2. That is the version. Am I clear? With this, the dependency is done. 6.2.2 done. Now just if you want, you can able to refresh it once, or it's not required as. Okay, after doing that, just I'm refreshing. I'll go to first this package, and here I'm going to delete the app.java file. This is by default created one hello world program. Now I want to create a new, and I want to create a class. Let's say first we are going to create only one class called service A. And of course, we'll also create service A, service B. Both are the 2 classes we are creating. Service A. Okay, service A. And I'm just writing, just understand, I'm writing public service A. Okay, currently I'm not writing any dependencies. I'm writing SOP statement. And the SOP statement is saying that, okay, you write service A constructor. So tell me, I just want to write annotation called @component. Component I can write or service I can write. Okay, @component is the annotation I want to write. Okay, now this is my service A. This is another one which is called service B. Currently, service A, service B are the independent classes. They are the independent Spring Bean components. Okay, @component I'm writing. Next I'm writing constructor. I'm not writing any scope annotation. I'm just writing constructor, public service B. System.out.println. System.out.println. Which one constructor? Service B constructor. Now tell me, what is the default scope of service A and what is the default scope of service B? Singleton. Both are singleton, right? Now I want to create one configuration class in config package. So I want to change the package from beans to config. Another package. I want to create a new package called com.pack. I want to cancel it. Right click on main Java, new package. What is the name of the package I want? com.pack.config. Now guys, this is the new package I'm creating called com.pack.config. And under this new package, I want to create one new class, and my class name is app.config. What's the name? App.config. It is a configuration class. So tell me, to mark that this is the configuration class, which annotation of I have to use? Configuration. At the configuration class, we also need to enable the components auto scanning feature of a Spring. So how can, which annotation I have to write? Okay, annotation is component scan. Value is equal to base packages is equal to anything that we can write. What is our package name? com.pack. Do you have any properties files here? No. Am I going to create any bean methods? No. Bean methods also I'm not writing. I don't want any bean methods currently. If there is a use, then we'll write the bean methods. Otherwise, we don't write. So currently, you guys understood that there is configuration class created. Lastly, I want to create one more package, one more new package I also want to create with the name called com.pack.main. Okay, we want to make our code cleaner and by writing in different packages. Now you tell me, we are going to create one new class and I want to make the class name as main. What's the class name? Main with the public static void main. Main.java. So here I need to start the Spring container. Now could you guys tell me how to start the Spring container? Application context. Okay, context CTX is equal to new. Annotation config application context. And we should provide our configuration class as app_config.class. Look at this. That's it. I'm starting the Spring container. See, actually, if I want to get any object from the container, then I need to call which method? GetBean method. I don't want to call getBean method. I just want to start the container. You know, when I start the container, then the Spring container is going to scan for the Spring components because of component scan feature is enabled here. And at the time of component scan, Spring is identified that what? The Spring has identified that service A is a component. Service B is also a component. And what is the scope that is provided for service A? Singleton. So scope is a singleton. What it is telling the container? If the scope singleton, then what container understood? The container has understood that I should create only one object within the container and I have to use it. Am I right or not? Okay, it is going to create the object. So if object is created, then constructor is executed. This is called parameter only. Am I right or not? Very good. Next. It has identified service B also. With a scope prototype, the container has understood that what? I should create one object of this class within the container and I have to use it. So it's going to create one object only. Again, this constructor got executed. Now let us run this application to build it. First, we are going to build application once package. And once after getting a build success message, I have to refresh the project once. And after once I have refreshed it, now I just want to run this main class. Java application. Now you tell me, what are the messages I'm getting? Service A constructor, service B constructor. One time only we are getting. Nothing but how many objects are created? Two objects are created. Two objects are created. One object is created for service A, another one object is created for service B because the scope is what? Singleton. Scope is singleton. Please try to understand. Okay. Observe it. Suppose service A, SA is equal to CTX dot getBean of service A dot class. We can also provide dot class as parameter. This is called class object. It is a class object, class object in Java. So try to understand now. CTX dot getBean of service A dot class. Please understand. Same statement, guys, same statement. I want repeat for 3 times. This is SA1. This is SA2. This is SA3. Okay, na? Guys, tell me how many times now the Spring container is going to create the object for service A? What is the default scope of the service A class? Singleton. The default scope is singleton. The scope is singleton. What the container has understood? It has to create only one object, and the same object should be used every time. Within the container, there should be only single object should be created for the bean class. So one object is created. But here in my main program, I am requesting or I want to get this object of service A. How many times I want to get from the container? 3 times I want to get. If I want to get 3 times, will the container create 3 times or will return the same object for 3 times? Will return the same object for 3 times, but doesn't create the 3 objects. That we want to know. Again, we run. See, are you going to get the same output or not? Are you getting service A constructor, service A constructor, service A constructor like 3 times? Are you getting it? No. No, we are not getting that. Okay. Let us do one more thing, guys. Oh, time is running out. Huh? Okay. See here, guys. I want to write scope as @scope prototype. What is the scope now? Prototype. For which bean? For which bean? Service A. What is the annotation? Prototype. If I write prototype scope, what is understood? If I write scope as prototype, then what the container has understood? The container has to create a new object every time it is required. Then you tell me this main program is asking the container that I want object of service A. How many times? 3 times. Then what container has to do? The container has to create a new object every time. Every time. So what container will do now? Container will create a new object and will return that object. First time, second time, third time. So then tell me how many times the constructor of service A will be executed now? 3 times. Now we can see service A, service A, service A. How many times executed? 3 times, which means what is the scope of this service A now? Prototype. But service B? Singleton. Very good. I have a question. Suppose I kept this code in comments. Then how many objects are created for the service A by the Spring container? How many objects are created now?
1 object.
Suppose I kept these 3 lines of code in comments, and now I'm asking you guys tell me how many objects are created for the class service A. How many objects are created? What is the scope of the service A?
2
Prototype.
objects.
Prototype. Prototype. If the scope is prototype, then the container has understood that what? What the container has understood? Create a new object whenever it is required. Create a new object always. A new object. Tell me here, I'm writing 3 times service A, service A, service A, but I kept it in comment now. Then tell me how many objects are created for service A? 0. When object should be created for service A? When it is required. When it is required. Tell me in my code, this is service A, service B, independent classes. In main also, I am not asking for the object. Now you tell me, service A object is required in this application or not required? Not required. Not required. That's why container is not creating the object. What about service B? What is the scope now? Singleton. Scope singleton means container should create how many objects? 1 object. The question is, when that 1 object is created? When the container is started. Which means why I'm asking actually this point is, I want to tell you one point. What the point here? If the scope is singleton, if the scope is singleton, then that object will be early initialized by default. By default, initialized means early created, which is called early loaded by the container. What is that? Early loaded. The scope is prototype, lazy loaded by the container. What is that? Lazy loaded by the container. You tell me if I run this program. Why are you getting only one line of output? Why are you getting only service B constructor executed but not service A constructor? Because service B's scope is what? Singleton. If the bean is a singleton bean, it is lazily loaded or early loaded? Early loaded. By default, it is early loaded. Which bean is early loaded by default? Singleton. The scope is singleton. The scope is prototype. It is early loaded or lazy loaded? Lazy loaded means what? Object is created only when the object is really required. Until that time, object will not be created. That is called what? Lazy loaded. Early loading, lazy loading. Singleton beans are early loaded. Prototype beans are lazy loaded. You got the point, like singleton and prototype? Difference is there? Difference is there? Prototype and right. So when you want to make a singleton bean lazy, then what annotation have to use? @lazy. By default, I'm talking. By default, a singleton bean is early loaded. Prototype bean is lazy loaded. If you want to make a singleton bean also lazy loaded, then what annotation have to use? @lazy. By default lazy, we can't make it early. Let me go to service B, right? @lazy. We have discussed already. What's the scope of service B? Singleton. But we are telling that it should be lazy loaded. Now you run this program, you don't get any output. You see the console, you'll get a message called terminated. That's it. You got a message called what here? Terminated. But are you seeing any output on this console? No. Did you guys understood now? So what is the difference between singleton scope and prototype scope in Spring? What is the difference between singleton scope and prototype scope in Spring Framework? If the scope of a bean is singleton scope, then what does it mean? Only one object is created in the container and the same will be used by the container always. The scope is prototype. The container creates a new object each time whenever it is required and will use it. That is called what? Prototype. Second difference is what? If the scope is singleton, then it is loaded by default. Early loaded into the container by default. If the scope is prototype, it is lazy loaded into the container. Whenever it is required, only object is created. That's the difference between early loading and lazy loading. Okay, I'll tell you tomorrow about more on early loading and lazy. Do you know instance variable and static variable? Normally you have a class. Inside the class, you have an instance variable and you have a static variable. When the memory is created for static variable, when the class is loaded into the memory, JVM, immediately static variable will get memory. But what about instance variable? Until you create the object of your class, memory is not created for instance variable, which means what? Static variables are early loaded, instance variables are lazy loaded. You got the point now? That's it for today. Let's start the next session. Tomorrow, I'll give you more in detail. Thank you. Tomorrow, I will add the statements and I'll also give you more details, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.